Hello, I'm Kaveh Madani, Henry Hart Rice Senior Fellow at the Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies, in another episode of Contemporary Iran Forum, sponsored by the program in Iranian Studies at Yale. Um, um, I have the pleasure of hosting um, Dr. Mohammad Hossein Emadi, a former Iran ambassador to the FAO, and the former deputy minister of agriculture with lots of experience of agricultural development in that particular region of the world. Dr. Emadi, welcome to our program.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your time, and thank you for having me.
Okay, we are in the COVID-19 crisis, and let me start with asking you, how's COVID-19 related to food insecurity? Are there any implications?
According to actually the evidence that we can see during last several months and the impact of COVID-19, I can say that there is continuous wave of impact of COVID-19. The first wave, of course, is in the health and the actually life of the people, which is very costly. As you know, more than 1 million people have died during this crisis, and also millions of the people have been infected, and the whole life change. The second wave, of course, is the impact on the economy and the livelihood and the lifestyle of the people, which is, of course, in terms of economy, is one of the biggest, or better to say the biggest one, even during last 150 years of human history. And the third wave, according to the sort of studies and the impacts that we can see, is the impact of COVID-19 on the food security. Because when the economy, when the livelihood change, of course, the next stage would be the livelihood and the lifestyle of the people in terms of the food security. And we believe that the food security is targeted by COVID and would actually be much more important during upcoming time on all aspects, particularly in developing countries and underdeveloped countries. And that would be a very serious issue in terms of hunger, in terms of poverty, and in terms of nutrition of the people in long term.
So, we know that World Food Program now has got a Nobel Peace Prize, and we're talking about food security issues and the implications of COVID-19. Is there any political message here, as usual? So we know that the Nobel Peace Prize always has some message between the lines. Do you, have you received any signal?
To me, actually, this is very obvious that the Nobel Prize actually committee always try to analyze the situation of the world and find out the most important and influential factor on the food security, or better to say, in the world of global peace. And I think their selection of the WFP to get the prize have the very important and very direct message that the food security is very important, and enough attention have not been paid to this issue. Therefore, I think by sort of giving this prize, they give a hazard to the whole global and humanity that this is a hidden issue, and that would be a very, very serious issue in the short term. But unfortunately, it's not very obvious, because the people always, of course, think about their livelihood, their health, and of course the economy. But a little people are thinking about the long-term influence of the COVID-19 on the food security. And this prize, although always the Peace Nobel Prize was a controversial issue, but this time I think is a signal, a right signal in the right time to the people. And to the policymaker and the politician too, of course.
I mean, I think you're a bit biased because, until recently, you were the vice chair of the program committee at FAO.
Actually, I had several roles in the governing body of FAO. One was the chair of the COAG. The COAG is the technical committee which is responsible for the agriculture in the FAO to decide about the most important issues and decide about the most important priorities of agricultural sector in the FAO. The second was I was vice chair, as you mentioned, of the program committee. Program committee is the most important committee which decide about the program and the job that the FAO should do, and the direction and analyzing and also monitoring the process. Therefore, during last 3 years, actually, we were engaged not only as a permanent representative of Iran in FAO to handle the demands and the needs of our country from FAO, but also being part of the governing body on all stages during last 3 years. And in the meantime, as you mentioned earlier, it was not just FAO, because we were representative or ambassador to RBA, Rome-based agencies, including FAO, of course, the most important with the 75 years of history. And second was WFP, World Food Program. And the third was IFAD, International Fund for Agricultural Development.
So I'm right. There is a bias there, and it's a good bias. So congratulations to you and your colleagues and FAO and the World Food Program, because something of this significance is being recognized, and the efforts they have put into food supply chains and fighting poverty and hunger are being recognized. I think this is a huge accomplishment. Now, speaking of the World Food Program, FAO, and Iran, has the World Food Program been helping Iran in any way?
As you know, World Food Program actually is a global sort of organization, and the role is emergency humanitarian help to the people after the crisis, either the political crisis, the famine, all kind of issues, and particularly recent days is the COVID-19 and its impact on the sort of food security. WFP have a long history of cooperation with Iran. But at the moment, and during last several years, the major job of WFP was supporting Afghan refugees which are living on the camp in Iran. As you know, we have more than 1 million Afghan in Iran, but a very short number of them actually live in the camps. And the WFP helped Ministry of Interior of Iran to actually support the Afghan refugees in the refugee camps, and they paid almost $6 to $7 million per year for these refugees. And of course, after COVID, they actually doubled this type of support to help Afghan refugees in Iran. And of course, we had some support after the flood last year, March, to Iranian and so on. But as I mentioned, this depends on the request of Iranian government. But so far, support to Iranian people are very limited, because food security issue in Iran is not that in danger, but their support to Afghan refugees was a great help to help them and to give them some support during the COVID-19 and also during ordinary time and ordinary livelihood during last several years.
You just mentioned that Iran, food security is not a big issue in Iran, but let's say, or food insecurity, let's say. But let's define this, because I know that people in the FAO community and the intergovernmental agencies' definition and view of food security might be different from those who are in the defense and security spaces, or in the sanction spaces, whether sanctioning or fighting against sanctions. Their understanding of food insecurity might be different. What do you mean when you say Iran has no issue? What sort of food security definition are you considering?
According to the actual definition that FAO and most of RBA believe, food security is regular access of the public, all people, to the nutritious and healthy food in a sustainable manner, in such a way not to actually impact on the environment and ecosystem of the people. Therefore, the availability, the accessibility, and affordability of the food is a very, very important issue. And it has three dimensions. Of course, one is a food dimension in terms of the technicality. Second is economical dimension and the social dimension, to be actually fair and that all people have access to the food. And according to all these dimensions, I believe that in terms of availability, Iran has actually big investment during last 40 years on agriculture with a high cost, of course. And the total production of agricultural products in Iran is several times compared to last 40 years. Now is 128 million tons per year. In terms of availability, we have no serious issue. As you know, in the wheat, we are self-sufficient, and in some of the other products, we export the dairy products to the neighboring country, and it's one of the source of income of Iran during last several years. And in the time of revolution, we were fully imported, sort of in some products like cheese or something like that. That was a sort of different situation. But in terms of sort of affordability, which is the economical issue, because of the sanction, which has a big impact on the rate of exchange with US dollar during last several years, that makes a big difference, particularly in agricultural inputs, seed, fertilizer, and all these type of sort of inputs that the farmers need for production. The price gone up according to the rate of exchange. And this made a big impact on the value and the price of agricultural products. And of course, when the products sort of price go up, the purchase power of the middle class of Iran, which now are impacted by this type of measures, bring down the purchase power of the people, and that of course will impact on the food security. And the role of sanction is very important because it's impact on the rate of exchange, economy, and so on and so forth. And this is the major sort of concern about the food security in the long run and in the future.
So, but you know, one thing we continuously hear is that food is among the humanitarian exemptions of sanctions. So, has Iran faced food insecurity issues or the agriculture sector in terms of the people's access to food because of sanctions? So, in terms of buying products, has Iran faced any problem?
Actually, in the paper, it's food and medicine is not included. But as you know, it's not right. In the reality, when the sanction, with such a very, very severe sanction on financial and sort of money transfer, purchasing, and so on and so forth, make a real impact on the economy, of course, the role of sanction may not be written or may not be announced formally on the food or medicine. But in reality, it's not the case, because all type of agricultural inputs and products need the sort of very easy type of financial transfer, which is not possible, particularly with latest level of sanction, which made a lot of pressure on the financial transaction. Therefore, that impact on the food, but of course not as much as it impact on the sort of luxury things which imported from foreign countries. But in the meantime, you can see, and now after 3 years when I came back to Iran, I can see how it impacts on all products, including agriculture and the food products. Bread is a sort of different issue. You can find the bread with maybe a little bit of sort of higher price, but the rest of the food and so on and so forth impacted on the sort of inflation, and inflation mainly coming from the sanction, which impacted on the whole economy.
So, I mean, this is also something for the economists to debate, like how much of this is because of management and how much of it is because of sanctions, how much of it is the accumulation of problems over the years. You know, the way the country has done planning and has got itself prepared against these sorts of mechanisms, the sanctions mechanisms. And of course, as you mentioned, probably some of the impacts can be indirect. So you might put exemptions on some direct channels, but then there are, at the end of the day, some indirect channels. If the purchasing power of people drop, they might not afford buying food, and that's something very paralyzing and very important when it comes to the health of the people, and something which is, of course, the responsibility of the government to pay attention to and address. Speaking of this issue, so you mentioned bread. Bread is highly subsidized, right? So what sort of other agricultural products are highly subsidized? Because you said, again, food security has not been an issue so far for the Iranians.
Actually, as you know, the animal feed, particularly for poultry, which is the main source of the meat for Iranian. And during last several years, the role of the chicken and the actually white meat is gone up much more than the red meat. And for production of poultry, we need a lot of maize, soya bean, for the feed industry, for animal husbandry. That is the other issue that we import about $2 or $3 billion of the feed, mainly maize and sort of some medicine for the animal husbandry, and the soya bean for the poultry production is the main source of import for the poultry production and the dairy cattle sort of production. These are the major things which the subsidy is not direct like a bread, but indirectly it impacts on the low level of price. But of course, it's not that easy to handle it and to keep it in the same price that it was before, because the difference between the sort of basic needs US exchange rate with the open one in the open market or black market is very, very different, almost 8 times. Therefore, this is something that the government tried to keep it down, like eggs, like a dairy, like a poultry, but the price is going up, but not as much as the rate of exchange, but still is going up, and this is fluctuation by the impact of the sanction and the rate of exchange.
So the cost of home production has gone up immensely, right? As far as I understand. So for the same product, Iran is now spending much more over the whole supply chain, and at the end, still the price has gone up significantly, causing problems to the general public. I hope food insecurity will not become an issue, but clearly sanctions have had a role. And then, speaking of home production, a lot of people in Iran have been promoting the idea of self-sufficiency in food production. Is that in any sort of contrast with the definitions of food security? And then, we keep speaking of economic costs, but let's not also forget environmental costs. I know you're a systems thinker. We have spoken about holistic thinking and holistic plans many times, and you are one of those in the agricultural sector who have cared a lot about water and environment, and we have had a lot of conversations about it. So we are seeing that this cost of food self-sufficiency for Iran, as far as I understand, is huge, and that makes this agenda unsustainable.
Actually, the definition of the food security have changed during last 40 years. For a first or second decade, I remember the self-sufficiency was the dominant concept, that we need to produce whatever we want to consume. But I'm pretty sure that this definition has gone. And the people are mainly self-reliance, going to the self-reliance type of agricultural economy, that we need to produce, but not necessarily whatever we do want and whatever we do actually demand, like the bread, like the rice, and so on. The main reason that this definition has been changed is 2 things. First of all, the border of Iran was open to the neighboring country. We are exporting billions of dollars of the agricultural products to the neighboring country like Afghanistan, like Iraq, and so on and so forth. Therefore, they found there is a big potential for production and export. The second and the most important impact is the environmental limitation and influencing factor, particularly the water. The role of water scarcity, particularly during the period of the dry area and dry sort of time, impacted on the policymakers that we cannot produce everything with any cost. We need to think about our sort of potential and limitations, and of course, the strength and limitation. That's why the idea and the concept of self-reliance with the tolerance actually come up in such a way that we need to actually look at the whole system, the food system and the food chain in such a way that which one is the sort of more potential for us and possible for us to produce according to our agroecological zone, ecological system that we have in terms of water, in terms of the soil, and in terms of vegetation and climate and so on and so forth. That's why the definition now is changed in terms of food security. And in the meantime, of course, the political issue with the superpowers and the sanctions and the war all also impacted on the definition. And now I think we are in the transition with the more focus on the role of environmental issue. And now the policymakers not only thinking, but also seeing the impact of our usage of the water, our usage of the soil, and degradation of the biodiversity, and so many factors which are not just as a message or academic sort of hazard, but this is a reality. And now this reality impacted on the new policies for agricultural development that we need to look at the reality and look at our privilege that we have, and in the meantime, the shortage that we are facing with. That's why I think the definition of food security is in the change and transition from self-sufficiency to actually invest on our sort of potential that we have, and in the meantime, changing the pattern of consumption among our consumers, that we are not going to have anything that we want. We need to think about the limitation that we have, the resources that we have in terms of human resource, in terms of the biodiversity and water and all soil and so on and so forth. That's something that I think very sort of closely is changing. The definition and conceptual framework is changing.
But you mentioned a very, very important issue, the issue of also the consumption pattern and what we choose to eat, and ironically, the Islamic Republic of Iran has been anti-West, but in terms of adopting the diet, the diet system and the food choices and what they put on their plates, they have been very westernized, and meats and red meats particularly, the use of red meat has been on the rise. That's part of the development process, but how is it happening in Iran? It seems very unsustainable, but something that has also a huge impact on the environment. Production of red meat. What are the implications?
Actually, as you know, I call it indigenous diet system. In any given situation, in any given countries, was completely adapted with the resources that they have and their sort of demands, in such a way to give them, to offer them sort of healthy diet based on the potential that they have. But unfortunately, during last 3 or up to even sometimes in some countries, capital 7 decades, the sort of consumption pattern change based on the Western type of fast food and lifestyle and so on and so forth. And this is one of the things that if we are thinking about the food system as a chain of sort of production to the consumption, we really need to think about the resources that we have, the indigenous diets that we had. As you know, the Persian diet, more or less like Mediterranean diet, was a very complete diet, completely related to the activity that the people have, completely related to the ecosystem that they have. But unfortunately, this is changed because we have one of the rapid rate of the sort of transition from rural life to urban life. And now 40 years ago, we were 70% rural and 30% urban, but now completely opposite. We have more than 78% urban and less than 23% rural. The whole this transition on the way of life, the sort of lifestyle and so on and so forth, change all this process. And in the meantime, as you know, like so many other countries, like even China, the percentage of the red meat and the rice gone up so rapidly, rocket type. And of course, Iran potential in terms of water, in terms of land, in terms of soil, cannot afford such a change of diet to produce this much of red meat. And of course, the rice and all other things, which is a new diet, which is not adapted with the demand and activity and lifestyle of the people. That's
Even
why
rice in the Iranian diet.
Yes, now the rice was not a dominant type of food for last 50 or 60 years, but now is much more dominant on the diet of Iranian, particularly the urban people. But the price, of course, put a lot of pressure to bring it down. But still, the people actually try and struggle to have it with the red meat of the meat and so on and so forth. These all parts from production to consumption as a food system really need to rethink if we are thinking about the food security in terms of having the nutritious, healthy, available, accessible, and affordable food for all people, to have a sustainable environment and sustainable ecosystem, which all of them are related to each other. Therefore, to have it all together, we need to change everything in terms of production, in terms of processing, and in terms of consumption.
Thank you. And as the last question, I assume that Iran is at the moment doing well because of the last 2 years have been wet and Iran has got a lot of rain. Am I understanding it correctly? Do you see any in the short run? Do you have any food supply issues in Iran in terms of strategic foods?
Actually, the rain during last 2 years, rainfall was not more than average. If we look at the 50 years record, of course, it's much better than last 5 or 7 years, which was dry years. And
but there were, in many locations, they were pretty much above the average. That they were wet years. Yes, you can say they were not, super high, but
yes.
They were, and they came in terms of flood and very intense. And I understand that, but still, in terms of magnitude, they were more than before. And there's some of the new problems that Iran faced was because of getting that much water. The problems the whole region experienced and other crises actually. Then is Iran doing well?
Actually, according to my sort of observation and the information that I have, the overall production of agriculture gone up. Now we have more than 128 million tons of the agricultural production. But in terms of the actually, how can I say, allocation of the water resources to the food that we are producing, there are lots of questions that need to be answered. And I think that in somehow regarding the wheat, the horticulture, the livestock, the animal production, and so on and so forth, I cannot see a very, very significant change. In summer type of vegetable we have. But in the meantime, we have not any market for the export, as if we were not under the sanction, we could sell it and have a much more gain and much more sort of income for the farmers. This is one of the problems. And as you mentioned, since it was an extreme type of rainfall in some area, there was a lot of negative aspect on the soil erosion, on the flood, and so on and so forth. But in terms of underground water, yes, of course, it was a good record. In the Urumia Lake, you know it better than me that we have a good sort of result, not only just because of rainfall, but of course, it was one of the factors. And in terms of underground water, that was a good, in some area, not all Iran, but in some area that was under this sort of scarcity of water scarcity, particularly underground water resources. But in general, we cannot rely on the good year or bad year. We need to think about the limitations in the long run. And the water, without any single drop, is one limitation. And the soil erosion and soil quality, in my understanding, some cases are much more important even than water. Therefore, these all factors need to be included and need to look at under the one sort of national plan for development and to reach the food security in the long run in such a way to have accessible, available, and affordable food in such a way to keep the sustainability of the environment. And that's not an easy job.
It's not an easy job with so many trade-offs and complexities and uncertainties, as you mentioned. But we learn by failing and we learn by doing, and hopefully we can do better in the future. When it comes to increased tonnage of production, we also have to be careful about what we produce. As you said, there's a big difference between producing saffron in terms of economic return and producing cucumber and eggplant. And then, as you said, having an international market for your products would be good, especially if it's regulated. Otherwise, we see smuggling and food smuggling over borders and issues like that. And then, the nutritious value of the products would matter. And that's something that smart leaders pay attention to and care about. It's a tough problem. It's a complex problem. And it becomes more complex when you have issues like sanctions, droughts, extreme events, climate change. And there's so many problems that unfortunately... COVID-19
on top of everything.
And so many other problems that unfortunately that part of the world is exposed to, and Iran is no exception. I just hope that things get better for the Iranian public, and the food sector would not be politicized and would not be securitized and taken advantage of, which eventually hurt many people, especially those who already live in poverty. Thank you so much, Dr. Emadi, for being on our program.
Thank you for having me, and thanks for the very sort of challenging discussion. Thank you.